Spider-Man 2 is one of the highest profile games of the year, and also one of the most technically accomplished. It represents a welcome, if iterative, improvement on the tech that we saw in the two prior Spider-Man outings on PS5 hardware, as John covered in his earlier video on the game. Few titles deliver Spider-Man 2's level of fidelity in an open-world environment, and the dramatic scale and death-defying speed of its set-piece sequences is something to behold. Insomniac's key ray tracing commitment, its excellent implementation of ray-traced reflections, also makes a return, along with a litany of supported visual modes and toggles. So how do these modes compare in terms of visual settings and framerate performance? Does the increased fidelity of Spider-Man 2 throw up any new issues for the PS5? At a basic level, Spider-Man 2 essentially has two visual modes, which have a few modifiers to suit a variety of tastes. There's a performance mode, which targets higher frame rates at a reduced quality level, and a fidelity mode, which offers better visuals at a lower frame rate. Both modes have ray-traced reflections enabled, so there's no performance mode without RT this time. In terms of underlying visual settings, the two modes look very similar at a glance. Both options provide the same essential visual experience outside of image quality. If we do look a bit closer though, there are some very clearly evident differences between the two. The ray-traced reflections were the first place that I thought to examine. In the performance mode, these are somewhat less detailed than in the fidelity mode, as you might expect. Both modes use a checkerboard reconstruction solution, and both appear perfectly reasonable. But the performance mode is clearly lacking that extra bit of clarity that the fidelity mode offers, at least in stills. I also noticed some substantial differences in reflections coverage between the two modes. Examining the opening cutscene, this gas tank lacks RT reflections in the performance mode, with a lower fidelity cube map seemingly used instead. The transparent surface reflections on the clock face, cabinets, and terrarium are totally missing, which makes for a pretty stark difference here. The metals on the door handle and kick plate also lack RT coverage in the performance mode. We can spot the absence of RT effects on the beaker in the back too, and on the blue lockers outside the classroom. In gameplay, I was able to spot similar cutbacks. In this trophy cabinet, for instance, the fidelity mode gets RT reflections on the transparent glass surface, as well as the semi-gloss trophies themselves. The performance mode predictably lacks these reflections completely. Likewise for the top of the lamppost here, and for a variety of other metallic surfaces throughout the game. I also noticed that the performance mode eschews RT reflections on very distant surfaces, like these buildings here, though this is particularly hard to notice outside of a head-to-head. Perhaps the most obvious cutback in gameplay is the lack of transparency reflections on car windows. In the performance mode, car windows get a cube map reflection that looks okay, but is visibly low resolution. There's no reflections of cars, Spider-Man, or pedestrians. In fidelity mode, the RT extends across the entire car body, so the car windows showcase accurate and detailed reflections, just like the car paint. When flying through the world, there's not much difference between the two modes, but up close the reflections coverage in fidelity mode is clearly a step ahead. My basic impression is that the performance mode drops many of the game's transparency reflections, and cuts back reflections on a range of surface materials. If you compare the two versions side by side, there are some notable differences, but I think in general play the performance mode looks perfectly reasonable. Critically, you do retain the game's reflections on building windows, water surfaces, and most glossy opaque surfaces in the performance mode, which make up the bulk of Spider-Man 2's ray tracing on screen. Foliage also sees some tweaks to run at a performant level at higher frame rates. If you do look closely, the foliage in performance mode is a bit less dense at far distances, with a bit more pop-in as you approach. Grass is drawn much further afield in the fidelity mode as well. Pedestrian activity is also curtailed in the performance mode. For idle pedestrians, like the people sitting at tables and on the stands here in Times Square, there's essentially no difference in pedestrian density. But when you observe a busy thoroughfare like this pedestrian street, there's a clear increase in civilian density in the fidelity mode. At a distance, both modes transition from 3D models to 2D imposters at about the same point from the camera, however. Shadow quality is also somewhat better in the Fidelity mode, with a somewhat higher resolution appearance across the game world. These shadows look a bit softer in the Performance mode and appear less defined, though they still look perfectly good across both visual options. Finally, character hair does seem to be simplified a bit in the Performance mode, with fewer hair strands and a less refined appearance than we see in the Fidelity mode. When we compare the two modes on offer in Spider-Man 2 to 2020's Spider-Man Remastered, the games do look similar, although there are some differences. The ray tracing quality does seem improved now, with the final RT resolve lacking the slightly blocky look that we saw in the earlier title. In stills, Spider-Man 2's RT appears very smooth, despite using a checkerboard technique just like its predecessors. The new RT does look somewhat more aliased at times, but it's clearly resolving more detail as well. If we stack up the Performance RT and Fidelity modes side by side in Spider-Man Remastered, the resolution of the reflections was also a key dividing line. But curiously, all the surfaces that have RT reflections in the earlier game also seem to exhibit RT reflections in its higher performance mode, unlike in Spider-Man 2. That also applies to the car windows, which show great looking RT reflections in the original Spider-Man game. The Spider-Man 2 performance mode doesn't have these window reflections, in addition to lacking other RT reflections throughout the game world. The pedestrians see the same divide as we saw in Spider-Man, with the same split in the density of mobile foot traffic between the Performance RT and Fidelity modes, and hair exhibits the same cutbacks that we see in the new game as well. On the whole, the settings split between the different visual options is pretty similar between the two games, though Spider-Man 2 takes a bit more of a visual hit in its higher framerate mode. So what about image quality? Spider-Man 2 presents a pretty detailed and smooth image, especially considering the high level of visual quality on display. The performance mode does suffer from more aliasing on fine details than the Fidelity option, which is especially evident on these buildings here, and it looks subtly less detailed. In terms of resolution, the performance mode operates from a range of 1008p to 1440p, reconstructed using Insomniac Games' temporal injection technique to 1440p. And the Fidelity mode operates from 1440p to 4K, reconstructed to 4K. Both modes look good on a 4K display, but the Fidelity mode clearly has an edge, which is particularly obvious with long-range detail. The performance mode doesn't always resolve very cleanly, though I think it still looks perfectly reasonable from a normal viewing distance. So those are the baseline visual modes, but the game has two key modifiers as well. You can turn on 120Hz output, which makes the Fidelity mode run at 40 FPS, lowering the typical resolution down closer to that 1440p lower bound. VRR is also an option. The default smooth option doesn't seem to affect the visuals, but selecting the uncapped option can adjust the resolution a bit. The performance mode can drop down to 936p at lowest with this option enabled, down from 1008p normally. These toggles are really best thought of as tweaks to fine-tune your experience. There are implications for performance, which I'll touch on in a moment, but the visuals remain about the same as their parent mode. So how do frame rates fare in Spider-Man 2? Let's start with the performance mode. Spider-Man 2 mostly hits and maintains a 60 FPS update here, with a very smooth presentation in typical gameplay. When the screen is filled with alpha effects though, the game can drop a small clutch of frames. The opening sequence provides a few examples, though these spots are rare through the rest of the game. I also noticed some traversal-related framerate dips while swinging throughout the open world. Traveling at very fast speeds can sometimes punch a small dent in the frame timeline, usually representing a single dropped frame. It's not an especially big deal, and getting an open world of this fidelity at Spider-Man traversal speeds is a big accomplishment at 60 FPS, but I did notice these while playing. In typical play though, Spider-Man 2 feels very solid in the performance mode. The Fidelity mode offers a 30 FPS update, which it reaches very consistently. The slight framerate wobbles of the performance mode are basically absent here, outside of a couple of one-off dropped frames during the most intense moments in the introduction. Cutscenes do exhibit a slight stutter on camera cuts, as the game seems to hold an extra frame for TAA purposes when the viewport shifts. This is also present in the performance mode, but it sticks out more at the slower update. Again though, in general play the game is a perfectly steady 30 FPS, and there's very little to criticize here. At 120Hz output, the Fidelity mode shifts to 40 FPS, which takes advantage of the higher display refresh to target a middle ground between the 30 FPS and 60 FPS modes we've just discussed. The overall turnout is quite similar to the other Fidelity mode option, but the game can drop a significant number of frames in certain intense moments during gameplay. On top of those selections, Spider-Man 2 also offers a VRR toggle, which can be set to off, smoothed, or uncapped. The smoothed option is essentially equivalent to the default VRR experience on PS5, evening out any framerate drops that might occur while playing. And the uncapped option allows Spider-Man 2 to push above its target framerate, using VRR to keep frame time divergence between frames to a minimum. These options require 120Hz output to be enabled to work as well. With the uncapped toggle enabled, we get around 40 to 60 FPS in the Fidelity mode, and between 60 and 80 FPS in the performance mode in typical play. It's not a revelatory increase in frame rate, but the improvement to fluidity is appreciable, if not transformative. There is a bit of fluctuation here though, which is noticeable, like with other unlocked VRR games. Like Insomniac's prior efforts and most of Sony's first-party output on PS5, Spider-Man 2 lands in very good technical shape. The performance is solid and visuals look great across a large range of graphical options. There's no way to go wrong here really, as the game is just very polished regardless of the mode you select. There's really just one wrinkle. The visual difference between the Fidelity and Performance modes is a bit larger here than in the prior Insomniac titles on PS5. On top of the typical tweaks to rendering resolution, hair, and draw distance, the ray traced reflections have been pruned a bit for the Performance mode. RT coverage is less extensive than the Fidelity mode, and a bit less extensive than the Performance RT modes in the older Spider-Man games as well. It's not something that stands out much in the heat of battle or when swinging around at high speeds, but if you stop and look around, there are obvious cutbacks. Of the available options, I'd personally probably still gravitate towards the Performance mode to get the best visual response. The Fidelity mode works very well too, and I think the 40 FPS Fidelity option strikes a good middle ground for those who want to retain more of the game's visual feature set, but also want to prioritize more fluid movement. Any preferences here are strictly a matter of personal taste, as each mode is very nicely calibrated to deliver attractive visuals within a given frame time target. So Spider-Man 2 is yet another Insomniac technical triumph. It's a beautiful game, and has virtually impeccable visual and performance credentials in every mode variation available to the player. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, use social media. Thanks for watching.